Hello and welcome to the second session of today's conference on differentiation in wider Europe. Now, my name is Senem Aydın-Düzgit. I'm a professor of international relations at Sabanci University in Istanbul. And I'm here joined by our speakers to discuss, I think, some of the topics that were also raised in the first session. Basically that on the one hand, we might be in a period where we're witnessing a narrative about more unification and the need for more solidarity. But on the other hand, there's also the question of what to do with countries in the wider European neighborhood, like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Moldova, like others. And also, of course, considering the slow pace of the enlargement process of the Western Balkan countries as well, and whether or not differentiated integration can be a way of dealing with some of those questions. So we'll talk about all these from the perspective of attaining security in Europe and out of a need of solidarity as well, whether the existing arrangements are sufficient or whether others would have to be thought of, whether we need more innovative means and stages in these processes. Now, I have 5 speakers with me to discuss these issues. We have Sven Biscop, who's the director of Egmont Institute, Juha Jokela, who's the program director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. We have Paul Morillas, director of the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, Eulalia Rubio. She's a senior research fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. And we have the member of European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer, with us today. So we'll go in the same order. Sven, can we begin with you? Perhaps we can begin with a sort of a large question, a broad question that for everyone to sort of start and kick off the discussion on how you would evaluate the current state and effectiveness of existing differentiation in wider Europe, and perhaps a few words on the prospect for the future as well, regarding institutional and legal arrangements, maybe. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My focus has been mostly on differentiation in the field of defense as part of Europe's global stance. And if you ask me what the effectiveness is of differentiation, I guess I would ask, effectiveness? Where? So it has been very, very ineffective. My sense is that we have created the right instruments in the defense field that allow us in very flexible formats to advance integration in the field of defense, but we just don't use them. We just don't use them at all. Permanent structured cooperation offers a whole menu, and we've ordered the appetizer, and then we said, I'm not hungry, actually. And so it's basically just sitting there. That is my strong feeling. Now there is another strong momentum to move in the field of defense. They're not necessarily in an EU context because of the war in Ukraine. Just about every EU and NATO country has announced that they will spend more on defense. But now the question is, what will they spend it on? And will they spend each of that just in their own corner? Or will they to some extent at least try to align and coordinate that extra spending? Or will they even pool some of that extra spending? My impression so far is that the tendency is to say, no, we each spend this in our own corner, on our own immediate needs. And I think that would be a really missed opportunity, especially because some member states are entering into new capability fields, right? Because you can say, okay, we have 27 armies, navies, and air forces, you cannot wish them away. But if you're entering new fields, it would really be a pity to start once again by building up 27 different capabilities, then to discover that they're too small to be really useful. So I think the EU now has a clear role to play, actually, at the very least as a kind of clearinghouse, between all those national intentions, NATO target, because everybody's mind is on territorial defense and deterrence, to make sure that we align and we create synergies and effects of scale where we can, but also at the same time to make sure that the EU's own priorities are not forgotten, because we're all now looking to the east, to Russia and Ukraine, but the south is also still there. There will be security problems in the south that will demand military action. Nobody else is probably going to take the lead. So the strategic compass and not really the rapid deployment capacity is absolutely necessary. So I would say I see a really great urgency and a huge potential role that the EU could now play. And this will be in all kinds of diversified formats. But I'm absolutely not sure that we will see this role played, because I'm not convinced that this is where capitals want to go. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So, Juha, at this point, I'd like to turn to you also to get the Finnish perspective on this, since we also have now a new development, of course, after the war with Finland expressing an interest in joining NATO. So what would be your take?
Well, thank you. And thank you very much, Senem. It's great to be here. I think we had the kickoff live of this project, and now we have the final conference, so two major events. And of course, the world has changed a lot. The war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression, is something that we have tried to think very hard when we were preparing for this conference. Because I think one of the issues that we looked in the foreign and security policy field was that what can differentiate integration, differentiate cooperation, bring it in terms of efficiency, effectiveness. But now, of course, it's been the first weeks of the war has been all about unity, working together. There is a political ambition, of course, not to talk about differentiation. We all know that there are cleavages, there are differences among member states, but the European Union, in its foreign and security policy, has tried to emerge as one actor with one voice. But I think when we look at this crisis and this war, as when we look at the previous ones, so I think there is quite a lot of what differentiation can bring into the EU's common foreign and security policy. And this is what we did in the project, and in our research we actually focused on informal forms of differentiated cooperation rather than the treaty-based mechanisms of differentiated integration. And the reason is very simple. Those haven't been used much in the foreign and security policy field. And here I think our outcomes, when we looked at the role of the lead groups, for instance, it's been discussed here today, the kind of the worries related to directorates, but we looked at the lead groups, especially in the cases of Iran, as well as Normandy Forward. And then the kind of a much more diverse field of different various groupings of differentiated cooperation constituted by member states, overlooking certain CFSP files, such as, for instance, the Middle East peace process or the Western Balkans. So there we saw that there is quite a lot that the differentiated cooperation can actually contribute, and our general assessment is rather positive on that. However, we also suggested, and in our analysis, that we have to be rather careful when we look at the kind of the operations of these differentiated cooperation formats, in that we found out that they bring in effectiveness, especially when they align with the established EU CFSP positions, as well as the norms and values of the Union. That was also something what was touched upon in the first panel of this conference. And I think this is a crucial point, actually, what comes out from there. And if one thinks about the current situation as well, and what the differentiated cooperation could potentially bring into that, so I think the link is clear there as well. And then we also highlighted in the kind of the recommendations that we provided that one has to be very careful, especially with the lead groups, that this doesn't lead to these challenges related to legitimacy, understood broadly, but also in terms of accountability, meaning the exclusion of those member states who are not part of the lead groups. And there we found out, for instance, that in the case of the Iran, where the EU3 plus EU, the High Representative, Vice President for Foreign and Security Policy, had an official function. It could actually provide a pathway to a sort of integrating the CFSP structures to the different forms of differentiated cooperation among the member states in the foreign policy field. This also relates to the kind of we know that during this institutional cycle, the High Representative has talked quite a bit about tasking foreign policy files to certain member state foreign ministries, for instance. This is another way of doing that. And this is, I think, important when these huge events like Russian aggression in Ukraine turn out to be longer term processes. And they are with us for a long time. So we have to think, how we retain the unity, how we work when the unity might scramble, and how we work with that differentiated cooperation framework in a way that kind of is sustainable in terms of one of the key kind of aspirations of this project. When it comes to Finland, of course, this is very interesting. Finland has been one of the vocal supporters of the CFSP, and the qualified majority voting proposals that are on the table have been sort of seen very positively in Finland. And now, of course, there is a kind of a question that if Finland joins NATO, what kind of profile Finland would actually take within NATO. And my take, given the Finnish history of integration, is that I think Finland would highlight the role of EU in the field of security. This comes to the kind of the broader elements of security, where we can actually see that the EU has now worked, meaning the sanctions, meaning the kind of the coordination done by the EU to provide this Western response, as well as all the fields that relates to the domains, including hybrid, cyber, so forth. So this is, of course, something that doesn't, they are not exclusively the NATO and EU, and we might actually see in the future, and this is not just the Finland or it's Sweden, which is also discussing the NATO membership, we might see more EU-NATO cooperation also in the future, but I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juha. Paul?
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Senem, and thank you to, of course, Nicoletta for great work in EU idea. I think it's worth mentioning it at the final conference. So I was rereading the papers today that we published in the framework of our foreign policy analysis in EU idea, and trying to compare these papers and the inputs that we provided there with what's happening on the ground, right? And what I found most striking is that the shortcomings that we identified in EU foreign policy are still very much existent when we compare them to the situation in Ukraine. We have a big divergence of interests between the member states when it comes to energy issues, to also economic aspects and so on vis-a-vis the current conflict. We still have in other scenarios entrenched foreign policy positions that prevent EU foreign policy to being very strong. We still have a lack of strategic culture in general in EU foreign policy, but somehow these long recurrent trends in EU foreign policy have not prevented us to act united in when it comes to Ukraine. And I was asking myself, how is this possible if all these very core components of EU foreign policy are still present? How is this possible that in the highest risk possible, which is Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, how is this possible that unity has prevailed over division if the substance, if the laying grounds for EU foreign policy haven't changed at all in the last years, right? And of course, these changes or this situation hasn't come as or this unity situation hasn't come as a consequence of big reforms or big changes in the mechanisms that we have in EU foreign policy. We have not started to discuss treaty change. We are not discussing seriously qualified majority voting in EU foreign policy. So the big solutions are not there yet, even if we should start thinking about those big solutions. But we haven't really changed anything substantial against this. So the question, taking that into account, was still more pertinent. I mean, how is this possible? And I came out with 4 necessary things that the Ukraine crisis, I think, has put forward, and that are perhaps more important than the things that brought us together, at least in the work packages dealing with foreign policy issues that relate to institutional arrangements or to mechanisms that exist out there. And these 4 important aspects that I think are present today and were not present in previous crises are: first, trust. I think there is trust between EU leaders among themselves on the danger that the situation currently represents, and there's empathy towards the other member states who are suffering, first and foremost, the possibility of conflict in their own territories. This trust is combined today with pro-EU leadership in major member states. Of course, we'll see what happens on Sunday. We'll see. But if, let's be clear, if Le Pen doesn't win, we'll still have this window of opportunity whereby pro-EU leadership is able to build on the trust that has been generated after the pandemic and after Ukraine. So without trust, without political trust, I think there's not a way that any formal mechanism or informal mechanism can help to make EU foreign policy more effective. Second aspect that I think is quite important and very necessary is the presence of positive incentives. These positive incentives for EU foreign policy can come either from external threats, such as Russia, or from the ability to use internal resources, as the Next Generation EU has shown. When there are incentives for joint action, well, joint action happens. And I insist that these incentives can be very bad, such as Russia's aggression, or can be very good when it comes to building new tools, such as the Next Generation EU. Third thing that I think is quite important and linked also to the trust and the political trust that I mentioned first is the existence of group pressure. I mean, if Hungary hasn't gone all the way to block decisions, it's also because the group pressure was very important when acting on the Ukraine crisis. The incentives for blocking decisions are still there. I mean, you still have the veto rights, you still have many aspects that can at least make you think differently about EU foreign policy and try to delay decisions. Well, this hasn't happened because the group pressure was very high on this occasion. And fourth, and very important as well, when there are imaginative solutions within the current framework. And this leads to or relates to what Juha was mentioning before. I mean, any use of common resources that we have been using for defense, as the European Peace Facility, any common resources that we have gathered after the pandemic and through common debt scheme, and so all these solutions have been found within existing frameworks. But these existing frameworks have been read in a way that make these solutions possible. And we have acted in a way that these imaginative solutions have happened. And this is where informal mechanisms also of differentiated integration have worked best before, because the formal ones, as Juha was rightly mentioning, haven't, and Sven also mentioned that, haven't worked. I mean, the constructive abstention and enhanced cooperation, well, these are the formal mechanisms that are rarely used. But the informal ones have been very successful in some instances, such as the lead groups and the formats for that. So, and all this happens if we make the best out of existing frameworks. So I think that trust, incentives, group pressure, and these imaginative solutions have enabled us to act more united than we would have assumed, given the high risk of fracture that the Ukraine crisis would have generated upon us.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think this has been, the first 3 contributions have been very valuable in looking at this from a foreign and security and defense policy perspective. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn to Ilalia. And I know that you've been working a lot on economic policies in the scope of differentiated integration. And perhaps if you could tell us a bit more about the economic dimension of all this.
Okay, thank you very much. Happy to be here also to see the final conference of this project. Yeah, indeed, we work on the work package focus on economic differentiation in the economic policy field at the EU level. And I would say that what we start the start of the work on the work package, we were very much shaped, I would say, by the mindset of differentiation that came from the last crisis. And in the economic policy field, it was very much negative, actually. It was, well, differentiation had been the result of, you know, the needed, it was out of pragmatism because we couldn't do something at the, you know, at the EU 28, at the time we were with still the English. And it was something that didn't work very well. I mean, and it was very much intergovernmental also. If you look at the papers at that time that talk about differentiation in the economic policy field, is very much a criticism about, you know, these parallel treaties that we create, the fiscal compact, the ESM, everything very much, you know, under unanimity and dominated by member states without the participation of the parliament. So we were very much, I would say, framed by this vision of the economic differentiation. Then we did our research and we opened up the space because we were not only researching on EMU, we were researching on different sectoral policies in the single market. And what we say, I would say that the conclusions or the conclusions to which we arrived were first that EMU is not a single case of differentiation. When you enter inside the EMU, you see a lot of different arrangements of differentiation, and you can more or less also see that some of them work better than others. We did a paper on banking union, for instance. If you compare, I would say maybe the example of differentiation that didn't work very well within the EMU was ESM. And we have seen that for the COVID crisis, it didn't work very well because there was a strong negative perception of the ESM loans that made that no member state were, you know, appealed to ask for these loans. Whereas banking union was quite a case of success, if you want. I mean, it worked quite well. It was open up to non-member states. So within EMU, the first conclusion is that it is not an example of differentiation. When we look sometimes at papers on differentiation, we take EMU, Schengen as one single case, whereas there are very different things within the case of EMU. The second one is that if you look at other areas, and we did a paper on energy, for instance, you discover a wide variety of arrangements of differentiation, external and internal, which work very differently and which are much more instrumental sometimes, because the case of EMU, the most difficult ones or the most contested ones were differentiated instruments that serve to implement solidarity. And when you put into place something to share, to implement the budgetary solidarity, of course it's quite toxic. Of course it creates a lot of, you know, opposition. In energy, one thing that it comes from the paper is that you have very instrumental type of differentiated arrangements also with different logics, actually. In some of the cases, you see a logic more of coalition of the willing. Some member states want to go forward and put into place something, but very open to others. In other cases, it's just pure coordination among member states that share the same interests, like the energy community that includes some member states and some non-member states, and which is basically to coordinate, you know, the networks of energy among these member states. And therefore, also, what you have to expect from these arrangements is a bit different, because the objectives are a bit different. Third, maybe saying that, in the end of our work package, also we realized that also this idea that we have all in mind that there is not much differentiation in the single market. Well, already energy is in the single market. But we realized that there are some subtle forms of differentiation, and we were very much, I would say, motivated by the work on the other work packages to look at informal forms of differentiation. And we did a paper on IPSES. This is this new form of that member states can come together and pool resources to put into place an important project of common economic interest. And it has been done for different value chains like hydrogen or batteries and these kind of things. And this is it was interesting to see that this kind of informal methods of differentiations are getting more and more important now. And they pose also some problems. Actually, the paper put important questions about the governance of that, because it's so informal that sometimes also creates problems of, different, John-Eric would say, dominance of some actors among the others, public and private actors participating. So sometimes also there is a problem of what is the power of the private actors in this and the control public actors have on that. And also problems in terms of big firms, small firms. So there were a lot of problems related with the informality of this type of project. So if we use more of this informal differentiation, there should be a reflection on how to ensure governance that is at the same time agile, because we don't want something very complex, but that works well. Then let me say more general and more horizontal issue that came from our analysis, and let me say something that sounds a bit academic, maybe, no, but I think it's interesting to share this also. We struggle quite a lot about the concept of policy effectiveness. How to measure the policy effectiveness of differentiated arrangements is not easy and is not evident. Do you have to compare it to a counterfactual, something put into place at the EU28? How you do it? Do you have to judge the effectiveness as regards to the explicit objectives of these arrangements, but sometimes the objectives maybe are not well formulated? Do you have to take into account, and that's something that we said, effectiveness is good, it can be formulated in terms of attainment of your own objectives, but effectiveness is also not having a lot of undesirable effects for non-participating member states. So we integrated also this dimension. An effective arrangement, differentiated arrangement, has to be able not to create negative effects for the whole union and for the non-participating member states. So that was quite difficult to find the way of measuring this. And then maybe two final points. One thing that came from, we tried in the end, the last paper, we tried to look at commonalities of the different analyses we did. And one common thing that we found, well, we did quite a lot of reflections on the idea of the role of institutional factors. Actually, when you think about effectiveness in differentiated integration arrangements, you can basically think about three factors that have a lot of impact: the type of policy sector in which the integrated differentiated arrangement is taking place, the actors participating in it, whether they are the powerful actors or not, and the institutional arrangements of these integrated differentiated arrangements. And at the beginning, I think we came from the implicit hypothesis that the more institutionalized it was, the better in terms of capacity to enforce rules. And we had this implicit hypothesis that the less institutionalized, and that could be a risk for differentiated arrangements not having the capacity to enforce common decisions. But I think in the end, our conclusion was that what is important ultimately is that the institutional setup has to be adapted to the objectives of the arrangement. And sometimes you find arrangements, differentiated arrangements, in which it's very much important to be very flexible, and because they are more focused on promoting a change of views, on bottom-up ideas, on creating new solutions, and you need this kind of novelty, this kind of flexibility. Whereas other arrangements in which it is very much about taking a common decision and enforcing the common decision among member states participating in the arrangements, there you need a lot of enforcement capacity. So the important is not more or less institutionalization, but having the right type of institutional setup to make sure that these arrangements work. And just final point on what was said by Piero, I think at the first panel, the idea that, and I think it's something very present in our minds, in the economic policy field. It's true that the lesson from the last crisis is totally opposite to the lesson of the Eurozone crisis, which is that we are able to do it together, and that it seems difficult to come back to a situation in which we put into place EU instruments to exercise budgetary solidarity under differentiated arrangements. That's true, but at the same time, I mean, I would say that that's something that it has to be seen what will happen, but it's true that we feel this tendency now that it's very much difficult to come back to the previous situation, but it's only on solidarity, I would say, budgetary solidarity. Whereas differentiation in the economic policy field, as I have said, can take very different forms. It's not only, and not mainly actually, on exercising budgetary solidarity. That's the most difficult one, actually, because solidarity by nature is much better to do it together, actually. So do not underestimate the other types of differentiated arrangements that can exist and that can come also in the future. And I'm thinking, for instance, in the case of Hungary, we're talking about that. If, for instance, now we are talking about putting into place this common purchase of gas, it might happen that Hungary doesn't want to participate because they have a better deal with Russia. What the other member states will do, well, it is possible maybe that they decide to go along without Hungary, even if it's a bit, bad for them if Hungary have a different and better deal. But I would say it's not only pure budgetary solidarity. Differentiation takes different forms and responds to different needs. And I think it's not the end of the differentiation in the economic policy field.
Thank you very much, Lalia, for your views on the economic prospects and dimension. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Bütikofer from the European Parliament. Now, so far we've been listening a lot to the views and research of the policy community. Now I think we can hear about, the view perspective of the European Parliament and the political debates on the prospects of differentiation.
Thank you, Senem. Indeed, I'm not an expert, I'm a politician. So you will hear a kind of a different angle, I guess. And while other panelists have spoken about differentiation as an institutional arrangement to promote integration, taking into account less than willing partners that still have to be brought on board, I would try to describe differentiation from a different angle, namely as something that is brought to the table from the member states with their diverse narratives and their diverse set of goals, and that once it is recognized as acceptable and valuable, can be integrated into a common trajectory. I would say that the terms that you're using, sustainability, security, and solidarity, have been used almost like battle flags in different narratives, and they have been put against each other. Solidarity has been preached to us from the southern member states for decades, and everybody knew what it means. And some liked the message and some didn't that much. In my country, for instance, there have been other such battle flags like fiscal stability, the battle flag of the New Hanseatic League, or sovereignty, the battle flag of a lot of countries, particularly in the east and the central part of Europe. And of course, sustainability, the battle flag of all Germans wherever they reside. And the security has now become a common concern. And I feel that in the past, these different narratives, and of course I'm describing that only very roughly, but these different narratives have at times been treated as deviations from what should be the common course, instead of being interpreted as contributions to negotiating the common cause. constituent elements. And I believe that recently, in two crises, we've done better than expected in the pandemic and in the present crisis because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, because the approach to dealing with these different narratives has changed. The principle of solidarity was accepted in our answer to the pandemic, even by Mrs. Merkel, who at the point had the political capital to do that in Germany, and had, well, the ambition and the self-trust to take that step, even though it was completely in disaccord with what she had been preaching for years. And in the case of the present war in Ukraine, I mean, some small examples may underline what I have in mind. One Sunday, I recall one Sunday, I think it was in February, relatively, or maybe early March, I heard on the news that Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki had invited himself to Berlin to tell the Chancellor off. And he, even on the doorstep of the Chancellor's office, he told the media that he felt that Germany was not doing its due. And he continued in the same vein in the dialogue with the Chancellor and after the meeting. I don't know how well all of you are acquainted with German-Polish history, but such a thing has not happened in 400 years. And in a way, it reflected a situation where the governments that normally would be considered the leaders of Europe were not leading that much, and other governments that normally would be considered the ones that follow or that modify a policy at best were stepping up to lead. Also regarding some, let's say, Baltic countries or Romania and others. So I feel in this situation, the normalcy of what it was that should constitute a European course was not a given. And because of that, there was this opportunity for bringing differentiated perspectives together and on the basis of that, forming a common European approach. And the lesson of that is, from my point of view, that the whole focus on QMV in foreign policy is completely misguided. Because QMV seems to imply that you have to get rid of the blocking maneuvers of some nuisances, whereas the 5 packages that we have produced with sanctions have demonstrated that even under unanimity rule, we can indeed come up with results that are not just empty, that are meaningful, that are without example even, and push a common policy. And I believe that the whole focus on QMV has been an excuse also for member states that did not want to invest the capital. And Paul, you said member states created peer pressure. And I think that has indeed been one of the decisive factors, that it just wasn't acceptable that Olaf Scholz would not allow German artillery pieces produced in the GDR, then sold to Finland, then sold to Estonia, then offered to Ukraine to be given to the Ukrainians because of the German arms exports policy. It was just not acceptable around Europe. He couldn't do it. And I think this role of member states in investing, instead of leaving the task of bringing the consensus together to the European Parliament and the European Commission and the Court of Justice, that makes a difference. And I believe that in this regard, what we're learning is a lesson that member state investment is essential, but member state investment is just not just something that we tell member states from Brussels to finally come up with. It's something that we have to coordinate on the basis of what member states really offer. And I think that way of looking at differentiation is a more integrative one. And that is basically what I think we have always propagated under the term unity in diversity. This is what it used to mean. And I think there has been a deviation on our part, trying to tell all the actors in the European Union how diverse they would be allowed to be in order to not stop the bandwagon. And I think we have to inverse the perspective that we choose and build on that positive experience.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now, I don't seem to have any questions online, so I'm going to turn straight to the floor. Andrew Duff.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm surprised that the discussion on the security aspect of integration problems at the moment hasn't even mentioned the strategic compass, which was a... Oh, did you? I'm awfully sorry. I must have been just looking out of the window. But I mean, this thing took 2 years or something to negotiate. I was astonished how, I mean, I'm an outsider now. Of course, I come from a third country, but I have an interest in this question. I was surprised to see that it said so little on cooperation with NATO. And I wondered how you think, if you think, the strategic compass exercise can be aligned to NATO's strategic concept paper, which is supposed to be promulgated in June. And Joseph Borrell has proposed that there's a thing called an EU partnership forum, something that is new, that will meet every 2 years. And I wondered if that can be taken at all seriously in the present critical circumstances that we face. And if my suspicions about the comparative failure of this exercise are correct, well, what on earth are we going to do about it now?
Thank you. I think we'll collect a few questions and then I'll turn to the speakers. Emmanuel?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So I would like to build upon what Paul has said and also Mr. Bütikofer, and which I think is absolutely crucial. That is that the argument that Paul you have developed is that in foreign policy you had extensive differentiation, but it did not prevent a common position in the Ukrainian crisis. And this, I think it's something, I mean, to make a bit of self-criticism of what I have done inside the project and in WP6, I think it's something indeed that we may have undervalued. And I think that Mr. Bütikofer is right about this ideas that QMV is not the solution necessarily. That is, when we could see problems of effectiveness in relation to differentiation, what we were looking at was necessarily more integration. We're thinking, okay, there is a problem of effectiveness in Schengen, and so it means that we need more integration, but not necessarily, because the Ukrainian case shows to us that you can have an extensive level of differentiation and nevertheless, without QMV and without further integration, have common position in the right moment. And the question is, why do we have that in certain cases and not in others? So it seems to me that, I mean, we can think that the Council can build consensus, but more deeply, one would say that it's because the member states had shared interests, or others would say shared preferences in that particular question. And so the issue would be then, instead of moving towards more integration when there is an issue with effectiveness, how can we make the interests or preferences of the member states more compatible, more common? And this, it seems to me, is a different road that we have not yet explored. I mean, in the Ukrainian case, I mean, there is a big debate about the origins of this war, but I think the fact how the EU had developed its policies meant that if Russia wanted to revise the post-Cold War status quo, it had to go to outright aggression. Though increasing cooperation with Ukraine, trade and so on, meant that Russia was limited in its range of options. It had to go through outright aggression that would make the member states react together. And so what I am trying to think now is that what we did in Schengen, can we transpose this to the Schengen issue? I am pretty confident indeed that if we try to achieve more integration in the differentiated Schengen system, it may not work. So the question is why in this differentiated system we have common position in the case of Ukraine and we have diverging position in the case of Schengen, as we saw. It's because the member states have different interests. They don't have, or their interest leads them into not cooperating. And this requires acting on the way states react to migration more broadly. So this is a matter of internal reforms as well, not more integration, which can actually damage the EU system. We did not argue in favor of a lot of integration in Schengen, but this is where we were looking, and it may not be the solution. Actually, it may more be about transforming EU national debates about migration.
Okay, Piero?
I had two, sorry, I had two things to say, but I'll just say the first one in the interest of time. And the first one, in the best conference audience tradition, is more of a comment than a question. I very much, of course, agree with the idea that, I said that myself, of course, I agree with the idea that the crisis, the Ukraine crisis, the aggression of Russia brought about a unified response, and that is a fact. But at the same time, and here I sympathize with what Eulalia said also, I am afraid that I wonder whether we're not pretty soon going to see that this is taking a pattern, a trajectory that is the opposite of what happened with COVID-19, where the knee-jerk reaction was one of division. Remember the Dutch-Italian spat, right? Oh, this seems like ages ago, but it was relatively recent. And then, you know, also because, or mainly because, you know, the virus being what it is, you know, it became like I said before, a symmetric problem. Then the more reflective reaction was one of unity. And I'm afraid that we might be seeing the opposite in the case of Ukraine, when the immediate reaction was one of unity, but we already we are already seeing that this unity is very fragile. And it seems to me that the more the war will be limited geographically, as it is more than before now, and in terms of warfare, meaning the more it stays a conventional war, the more these cleavages will become strong. And the problem here is that these cleavages are not just geopolitical; they are also ideological, and they are. And the additional problem is that they might pretty soon become about not just the odd one out, Hungary, but about bigger players than that. In particular, like I said before, I'm thinking about Germany and Italy. So I'm not sure that I share the optimism that has been. I wish that would be, of course, the case, but analytically speaking, I'm not sure that I would share this optimism for the months to come. And so this was like just a comment, so to speak, but my question would be, how would you react? What would you say about this possible scenario of the trajectory being from one of you immediate unity more and more into one of diversity and differentiation at the end of the day? What then?
Thank you, Piero. Now I'm going to turn to the speakers, and I think we can go in the same order. So Sven, Biscop, can we begin with you?
Right. I want to.
And each speaker would have about 3 to 4 minutes or so that we finish at 6.
I will pick up the question on the compass. As I've joked a few times now, I have some compassion for the authors of the compass, because it reminds me of when I had finished my PhD dissertation and tried to turn it into a book. It was about the EU and the Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East. I was just about finished. Then the Americans invaded Iraq. I thought, Then they have 3 choices. You can pretend it didn't happen. You can rewrite the whole thing entirely, or you add a sentence to the introduction, a sentence to the conclusion. I think the authors of the compass went for a combination of the latter two, but basically the thing was finished, right? All one could hope for, I think, is that at least a war in Ukraine would lend some more urgency to the compass. Of course, the EU is the EU, so the compass was never going to be about deterrence and territorial defense in classic military terms. It's rather about building capabilities that you also need for that, for deterrence and territorial defense. It's about the hybrid dimension, where I think the EU has a lot more leeway to act, as many of the instruments are there, not so much at NATO often. And of course, we should not forget about the South, as I said. So the priorities are perhaps right, but I'm not sure whether it will get a lot of traction. Now, I had argued that the fact that the EU and NATO are more or less at the same time writing a new strategic paper, that in theory it would be a chance to align them, perhaps even to coordinate that. But we've seen the opposite. And I think certainly on the NATO side, to my knowledge, there was absolutely no willingness at the top to do that. I've been told by some people that basically the SecGen did a telephone round calling some of the usual suspects and said, this is the organization calling. The organization has done a lot for you. Now it's your time to do something back for the organization. This idea, this and that idea in the compass, the organization does not like it. You know what to do. Kill it. And that is to some extent what happened, because if you were able to see the various versions of the compass, sadly, some of the really good, sharp ideas in the first draft were all watered down or disappeared from the later draft. So I think in terms of EU and NATO, it is a missed opportunity, but it was probably unrealistic to hope for more in the first place. Now we must implement it, and I think as EU must really say, look, if we're ever going to get the capabilities that we need to strengthen the European contribution to NATO's deterrence and defense, finally use the instruments that we have. And the priorities that the compass outlines are very much linked to territorial defense, main battle tanks, future combat aircraft. This is not for some EU training mission in Mozambique that we're going to need that, right? So this is finally how the link is there, but we don't act upon it so far. And I think now I end on that. There's a meeting announced for May, an informal European Council on Defense and the actual European Council, where I hope finally we'll get some idea of, okay, we have a list of priorities now. In fact, we have many lists of priorities. Now, which member state is going to put some money in which of them, but also which member state is then saying, okay, I'm going to build X capability in this area, because this we don't know. And for me, that's a really strange bit about the compass. We took 2 years to write it, as you said. Many people had argued from the start, well, if this is to be credible, then make sure that at the moment you adopt it, you also have some concrete capability initiative to announce, and there is nothing. And now we're very late. Thank you.
Thank you. Juha?
Okay, thank you. Maybe I start with the unity and the kind of the response to the Ukraine crisis and the war. I think what I tried to say in my opening remarks was that, you know, this is something what has happened now, and there are good reasons for it. Those been also elucidated by others here. But I think we are all, if not skeptical, but at least a little bit reserved that how long that might last and what kind of lies ahead. And I think this is something what we also discussed quite a bit and try to elucidate, that this is where the differentiated cooperation potentially could bring in kind of a effectiveness in a situation where the unitary action is not necessarily possible. But I will touch on one question which also was the second comment of Andrew, and it relates to the external differentiation. And I think this is also very important in terms of when we discuss the EU's response. We haven't discussed at all the role of US here now. And if we think about, you know, these partnerships, which are kind of the topic of the external differentiation, so one can of course ask very serious questions about the strategic autonomy of the EU and its effective foreign policy making if there wouldn't have been Joe Biden administration in Washington and all the work that the US has put in this unitary European Union position. But I think it also plays interestingly, I think you kind of touch upon the question of what is the role of the UK in all of that. And of course, we have here people from Norway, we have Switzerland on board, and you know, all these external partnerships, whether they're also part of the Eastern Partnership or the Western Balkans, I think this is really interesting what has now happened in terms of the response to the Ukraine crisis. Because what we found out when we did a kind of overview of different arrangements and kind of whether they have bring in effectiveness, this was actually the paper where Senem was also contributing. So one of the key outcomes was that it was actually more often the political alignment and interest that counted than the institutional arrangements. And this is of course something what we have discussed a lot with the Brexit process in the foreign policy field, for instance. And I think this brings in quite interesting element about the EU unity and the effectiveness of the CFSP in terms of this external differentiation and how others can kind of influence and bring about this unity actually. But then I think it's also important to think about the world ahead of us. And I think this brings in me to the kind of the discussions we have had within the strategic autonomy debate, but also with the QMB and the effectiveness of the CFSP, which is kind of internal to the EU. Because what the Russian aggression means actually is that we will see a quite fierce strategic competition in the global fora and different regions as well. We don't know yet where Russia ends up, you know, how isolated Russia is, what are the Russia's partners and so forth. But what EU can be sure of, that when we look at global institutions, when we look at Africa, when we look at the neighborhoods, there is much fiercer competition. And I don't know whether we can anymore talk about strategic competition, whether we should talk about strategic rivalry. And this brings us back to the question that what can be done here internally to make CFSP efficient and EU better faced to this kind of strategic competition. And I think the kind of the elements that we try to put in this project, where are in the informal forms of differentiated cooperation, are all very important. And actually, I think they correspond to the views in a way that this could actually create a strategic culture, peer pressure, stakeholdership, all of that, which is very important. But I think there is also need to think about these more formal structures. I think one element, of course, is why the constructive abstention has not been used. It somehow, it strikes often when you think when it was introduced and what for, it hasn't been used. And then the QMV, I think it's of course something what we all know that it doesn't fly. But I think the discussion already is quite interesting because it makes the member states think about how the dynamic in the CFSP policy making would actually change and what that could bring into it. So I think also this kind of reflection that what it might bring in is kind of important in building kind of a common strategic culture or foreign policy culture in the EU. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juha. Paul?
Yeah, and perhaps they're so afraid of QMV looming that then they say, okay, let's stick to unanimity, but agree on the basis of unanimity, which is also quite interesting. But in any case, I think that there are two very interesting questions here. That one is how long will unity last, and whether we need more integration or not, as Emanuele and Piero put forward. And I think that we won't find an answer, but I will give a more my sense on also why we are speaking of unity today instead of division, regardless of how long this lasts. And I think also partly this comes as a consequence of the shared sense of political agreement on the crisis that we are witnessing on Ukraine. And this shared understanding that belonging to the European Union and acting together in the European Union makes sense not only for yourself, but makes sense also for your neighbors, for your peer countries, is something that had been lost in every previous crisis until the pandemic. I think that we approach, and the intergovernmental method very much contributed to this. We approach every crisis or every political discussion. We, when I say we, I mean heads of state and government, not me, but they approach their crisis as what's in for me, right? I mean, what can I get out of this one so that the next one, then someone will get something out and I won't. So let's secure some good rewards of belonging to the EU for myself in this crisis. Well, I think that this very contractual basis of belonging to the EU is something that we have not experienced so clearly in the pandemic and in Ukraine, because we have understood these two crises as a danger for another one. And perhaps by being a danger for another one, eventually they might be a danger for myself, for my own country. So this way of positive sum dynamics or positive sum thinking that have been present in these two crises had been absent in previous crises, and I think this is something we should capitalize on. As long as we understand EU integration for what it is, or for what it's supposed to be, which is a positive outcome of out of negotiations, then perhaps there is a way forward. If we go back to this, what's in it for me? Why do I belong to this group? If I take something out of it, well, then perhaps this unity will not last for so long. And that is something that, and I'll finish on this note, and I don't know whether that's true or not, but Spanish government has been putting forward on various occasions during the Ukraine crisis. And the ministry's argument was, if the Russians consider that Spain, that is traditionally a country that would like to see close relations with Russia, political relations, because it's far away, it's not a danger for us, so we need to mediate with Russia. This is the traditional position of Spain. If Russia sees that our position is very much in line with those who are most threatened by Russia's aggression within the EU, then Russia will change the perspective on how strong the EU is. I don't know whether that has been really the case, and if Russia has reacted or has been surprised by this EU unity as a consequence, not only of Spain's position, but as a consequence of this argument. But in any case, I think it's a nice way to understand the why you belong to the European Union. It's okay if Poland is, and I'm not friends with Poland, right? Spain, I'm not friends with Poland. But if Poland is concerned, perhaps that is my concern as well. Well, this is a dynamic that had been absent in previous crises, and I think it's worth studying further. Thank you.
Thank you, Eulalia.
Yes, yeah, I would say I'm in the part of those a bit skeptic about the capacity to keep unity, like Piero, like Juha. I agree with Paul that the narrative has totally changed. We are in a different narrative. Like with COVID, the narrative is much more positive and much more, we are in front of a common danger and not each one looking at its own interest and describing the crisis or the external threat as something that is related, the logic of moral hazard that was so dominant for the Eurozone crisis, that has totally changed. But if I look in particular in detail on specific actions and initiatives in the economic policy field, what we have is, first, there is this debate of whether we will see or not a new EU debt-based instrument, whether we will be able or not to have a consensus to raise new EU debt. We saw the French very quickly jumping on this before the informal summit in Versailles, because I think there was this automatic reflex of saying, well, we have the EU taboo on that has dropped in the last crisis, so immediately if we have a new major crisis, we have to use this, but that's the French. Then we start to see later on that there are still a lot of disagreements when you start looking in detail and when you pose the question for what we are going to spend together, how we are going to distribute this money or that we are going to borrow together, I think we are far from having a consensus. I mean, we are very far. If you talk with French people, they would say to you even that we can use it for military capacities, and that's something that I'm not at all sure that you can find a consensus at the EU level on that. So that's very difficult. So I'm not sure if we will arrive to this. Then the second thing that creates a lot of costs is the fact of compensating for this rise of energy prices for consumers and firms. This will have a huge cost, and if we don't keep, it will have a very asymmetric also effect. For some countries will be much important than for others, and it is crucial to have all the people together if we want to advance with sanctions. Otherwise, we cannot even dare to have an embargo. So the question is, we will be able to share this cost, and it's difficult to imagine. Also, it's difficult because I'm a bit afraid that the narrative of moral hazard comes again, saying, well, why we have to share with Germany that did very bad choices in the past and they didn't diversify the energy mixes and they decide to depend and they didn't do any effort to increase their dependence on Russian fossils. So it's not evident that there will be an agreement on that neither. And even if we look at the latest discussions at the level of EU summits, we see even the start of some differentiation. We have there are different approaches on how to respond to that, whether we want to intervene in the electricity market or not. And we have had this kind of ad hoc differentiation with the Iberian Peninsula, in which we have allowed Portugal and Spain to apply a different approach and to control, to put a cap on prices, on wholesale prices. So we are already having some sort of differentiation on the way of reacting to the crisis. So that's why I'm not very optimistic. I tend to be pessimist. That's also that's also natural in me. So maybe I am totally wrong, and we will see. Because it's true that the narrative have changed. I totally agree. But then there is a last point, and maybe because I come from France, but I remember you that there are elections, and what will happen if Le Pen wins? Because we're talking about Hungary, a kind of nuisance. But if Le Pen wins, then we will have a problem, and we will have a total different approach from a big member state on how to deal with Russia. And I take the words from Mr. Kloos that was saying differentiation has always been a pragmatic response to realities, but at the same time he was saying he was taking a very normative approach on the question of Hungary and Poland, saying by no means we have to allow differentiation on that. But this normative approach we can allow us to take in front of Hungary, but we cannot allow us to take in front of France. So we will have to be pragmatic if Le Pen wins. And we will have to accept differentiation on things that for us are not acceptable. I mean, otherwise we will accept that the breakup of the European Union. So that's why, I mean, of course, this is a scenario that I don't think it is likely to happen, but we never know. But I think if we take this idea that differentiation is a pragmatic response, we can never be sure that that we apply it to even on principles or on things that now seems to us out of question that we will apply differentiation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a very important point you made about Le Pen there. And also, even if she doesn't win, there's always the possibility that she will win at some point in the future. So the problems just get delayed and delayed. And they might be delayed up until a certain point when it just gets out of hand. And then there is disorganization and disunity instead. Now, for the final words, Mr. Bütikofer.
Thank you. I would like to sign on, first of all, to what's just been said about a possible need to differentiate in ways we never wanted to. I mean, when I look at Article 7 in the treaty, it clearly signals that deviation from a course of ever stronger union was just considered a lunatic option that could not happen in two countries at the same time. But if the outlier is not a single one only, but if there are a number of outliers, the outlier ceases being an outlier and it's an alternative. And then you have to deal with that. And that's why I sign on to this. The 2 points I wanted to make, one is about the strategic compass. I'm rather more optimistic, Andrew, than you sounded. Even though I'm not a great fan of the strategic compass, I think it's the futile effort basically to achieve strategic unity through a sequence of tactical steps. I think that's misguided from the beginning, and we are behind the curve with that. But what I do consider highly positive is the fact that the controversial term strategic autonomy appears only once in the whole document. And that is in a sentence in which it is combined with what I have called strategic solidarity with like-minded partners. So basically, strategic autonomy is not a singular guiding principle anymore. It is an element of an approach that walks on two legs, and enhancing our ability to act on our own is combined with our great effort to combine forces with other actors that are like-minded. And on that basis, I think we should be able to strike a deal with NATO. And the other point was about the issue of unity and how long will it last. I'm fundamentally optimistic because I feel that this great negative Russian surprise was a wake-up call of very unusual dimensions. The German foreign minister said on the day after the invasion began, we woke up and the world was different. And I think that's not a unique experience. I think that's what a lot of people felt. And we are now clearly in what I would call rivalry territory. We had this tripartite definition of our relationship with the Chinese: partnership, competition, and systemic rivalry. It's clear we're now in rivalry territory. And the same is true with Russia. And in a way, to use a term from Mao Zedong, the main contradiction of today's world has been revealed through Russia's action. And that's not, I believe, not the contradiction between democracy and authoritarianism, as President Biden says. I think it's the contradiction between a rules-based multilateral international order and a new big power politics. And it resonated heavily in the United Nations Security Council when the ambassador from Kenya made exactly that point, that this was not just a European experience, that this was a global experience, and this is now a new age in which we have to actively defend the basis that we thought we had secured forever. And I believe that this understanding, this shared understanding, will create a basis for unity without implying that there will not be altercations and controversies. And I also believe that the language of security will play a particular role. In the German context, maybe it's interesting to remark, we as Greens had argued for renewable energies and for cutting the dependency from Russia forever, without being heard a lot. Our arguments were, number one, climate policy oriented, number two, innovation oriented. But now everybody is in favor of cutting the dependency on Russia because there is this security dimension. And all of a sudden, renewables is the answer to a security question. And the leader of the Free Democratic Party, Mr. Lindner, who is the finance minister in Germany, now said the renewables are freedom energies. That's as good as freedom fries. But I mean, what it makes you understand is this is now accepted because of this unifying power of the security narrative. And whereas we have had contradictions between sustainability and solidarity and all these different aspects, being endangered together and having to address the security issue together, that is a uniting narrative and language, I believe.
Thank you very much. Yes, I guess that could be the silver lining, maybe out of all this tragedy that's unfolding still. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for your interventions and also the audience for the great questions. I think it's been a wonderful, fantastic panel. We talked about the emergence of a more positive narrative, maybe of unity and more effective differentiation, but also obviously huge hurdles on the way regarding, for instance, the lack of political will, rise of Euroscepticism, populism that we haven't talked so much about, despite, of course, in the face of growing contestation from Russia in the wider neighborhood, but also at the global level from China, Turkey, India, and the like that needs to be considered. So I'd like to thank you all once again. So now I would like to invite you to the Brexit Awards ceremony that is going to take place upstairs. So, thank you.